The fog rolls in from the Atlantic just before dawn, thick and salt-heavy, wrapping itself around the limestone walls like a memory refusing to fade. In these early hours, before the gates open and the tourists arrive, the Breakers exists in something close to silence. Not true silence, of course. Nothing this large ever achieves true silence. There is the distant murmur of the ocean against the rock 70 feet below the rear terrace. There is the settling of wood and stone, the almost imperceptible creak of a house that has stood for nearly 130 years, shifting against the weight of its own grandeur. And beneath everything, humming through the walls like a heartbeat, there are the systems. The climate control maintaining precise humidity levels for the preservation of silk and gilt, the security monitors blinking in a basement room, the pipes carrying water through miles of hidden plumbing, the electrical circuits feeding light to chandeliers that once burned gas, then incandescent bulbs, and now carefully calibrated modern fixtures designed to mimic the glow of another century. This is the Breakers at rest. And even at rest, it is working. It has always been working. The house will welcome approximately 400,000 visitors this year, each paying for the privilege of walking through rooms designed to accommodate perhaps 40 guests at most. They will stand in the great hall and tilt their heads backward, trying to comprehend a ceiling that soars 50 feet above the floor, decorated with a painting that seems to open directly into an Italian sky. They will count the columns, the doorways, the windows that frame views of the Atlantic Ocean as if the entire sea were a decorative accessory. They will photograph the gilded trim, the crystal chandeliers, the bathroom fixtures plated in 14-karat gold, and they will try to imagine what it meant to be wealthy enough to build such a thing. But imagination is a kindly editor. It rarely includes the boiler room. It rarely includes the servants sleeping 3 to a room in the attic, rising before dawn to empty chamber pots and stoke fires and press linens and polish silver until it gleamed like captured moonlight. It rarely includes the dozens of rail cars hauling marble and limestone across a continent, or the Italian craftsmen working 14-hour days in foreign heat, or the groundskeepers trimming hedges that would need trimming again by the end of the week. It rarely includes the taxes, the repair bills, the impossible mathematics of maintaining something that was never designed to exist for more than a single generation's pleasure. The beauty is visible. The cost is not. And that is the central paradox of every palace ever built. Someone always pays. Someone is always paying still. To understand the Breakers, one must first understand the ocean. Not the ocean as romantic backdrop, not the postcards and paintings of waves crashing against New England rocks, but the ocean as economic engine. By the mid-19th century, Newport, Rhode Island had established itself as America's premier summer resort, a place where the nation's emerging industrial aristocracy came to escape the heat of their cities and the scrutiny of the working classes they employed. The coastline offered what money could not manufacture in Manhattan or Philadelphia: fresh salt air, cooling breezes, and the particular social privacy that comes when everyone in attendance is equally wealthy. The first significant wave of development came in the 1850s and 1860s, when families with names like Belmont and Astor constructed what they called cottages along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive. The term cottage was, even then, a deliberate understatement, a form of aristocratic humor. These were mansions by any reasonable standard, summer retreats with 20 or 30 rooms, full staffs of servants, and grounds measured in acres. But they were still largely wooden structures, still within the vocabulary of American domestic architecture as it existed at the time. The Breakers would change everything. The property itself had a history before the Vanderbilts arrived. In 1878, a tobacco merchant named Pierre Lorillard built the original Breakers, a substantial wooden Queen Anne-style mansion named for the waves that crashed against the cliffs at the edge of the property. When Lorillard sold the house in 1885, the buyer was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad and shipping magnate who had amassed one of the largest fortunes in American history. Cornelius II had inherited both the fortune and the family position. He was, by the 1880s, the de facto head of the Vanderbilt dynasty, chairman of the New York Central Railroad, and a man of such conventional morality that his siblings seemed to regard him as slightly dull. Where his brother, William K. Vanderbilt, threw lavish parties, and his sister-in-law, Alva Vanderbilt, waged social warfare with the New York aristocracy, Cornelius II attended church, avoided scandal, and worked long hours at the family business. He was not flashy, he was not imaginative, but he was enormously, almost incomprehensibly, rich. When the original Breakers burned to the ground in November of 1892, Cornelius II saw an opportunity. His wife, Alice Claypool Gwynn Vanderbilt, had never liked the wooden structure. She worried about fire, about the safety of their children, about the inadequacy of the house for truly grand entertaining. And Cornelius II, for all his personal restraint, understood something essential about wealth in the Gilded Age. It had to be displayed. Power that remained invisible was power that could be questioned. A man who controlled railroads stretching from New York to Chicago, who employed tens of thousands of workers and commanded capital flows that could reshape entire industries, needed a house that matched his position. He needed something that could not burn. He needed something that would awe. The architect Richard Morris Hunt was the inevitable choice. Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he'd spent the previous decades establishing himself as the preferred architect of the American aristocracy. He had designed Marble House just down Bellevue Avenue for William K. Vanderbilt. He had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He understood how to blend European classicism with American ambition, how to make buildings that announce their owners' cultural sophistication while simultaneously declaring their financial dominance. Hunt was 65 years old when he received the commission. He would not live to see the house completed. But in the 20 months between the groundbreaking in 1893 and the first dinner party in 1895, he poured everything he knew about architecture, about power, and about the Italian Renaissance into the design of what would become the largest and most elaborate of all Newport cottages. The fundamental structure covers approximately 125,000 square feet, though measuring a building like the Breakers in square footage alone is like measuring a symphony by counting the notes. The house contains 70 rooms, 30 of which were dedicated to the use of the family. The remaining 40 were service spaces, kitchens, pantries, laundries, storage rooms, staff bedrooms, and the vast mechanical systems required to heat, light, and plumb a structure of such magnitude. The great hall at the center of the house rises through 2 full stories, 50 feet from floor to ceiling, with walls of French Caen limestone and floors of marble imported from Italy. The ceiling painting, executed by Italian artist Giovanni Battista Pellegrini in the early 18th century, and purchased specifically for this space, depicts a Mediterranean sky with goddesses and putti floating among clouds. The effect is deliberate. Upon entering the house, guests were meant to feel that they had stepped out of Rhode Island entirely and into an Italian palazzo, one where even the sky was subject to the owner's aesthetic preferences. But if the great hall was designed to disorient, the morning room was designed to transport. Hunt and the Vanderbilts decided that this room, where Alice Vanderbilt would receive her most intimate visitors, should be constructed entirely in France and shipped across the Atlantic for installation in Newport. The walls are covered with silver-leafed panels painted in a Rococo style depicting love, music, and pastoral pleasure. Every surface shimmers. Natural light enters through windows that frame the ocean, and the room seems to hover somewhere between reality and dream, between America and Europe, between the present moment and some idealized past that never quite existed. The dining room seats 34 at a table of carved oak beneath a ceiling painted in the Venetian manner with classical allegories of abundance and hospitality. 2 massive baccarat chandeliers hang from ornate ceiling medallions, each fixture containing over 100 candlelights. The walls are crimson alabaster, a stone so rare and so difficult to transport that the quarry in Algeria was reportedly reopened specifically to fulfill this commission. The library, by contrast, offers the illusion of scholarly intimacy. Circassian walnut paneling surrounds thousands of volumes bound in matching leather. A fireplace of green marble anchors one wall, and the ceiling beams are carved with Renaissance grotesques, mythological figures, and botanical motifs. Here, Cornelius II could imagine himself not merely as a railroad executive, but as a Renaissance prince, a patron of learning and culture, a man whose money represented not just power, but refinement. And above all these rooms, above the grand staircase with its wrought iron railings covered in gold leaf, above the music room where a pipe organ could fill the entire first floor with sacred music, above the sitting rooms and guest chambers and the nursery where Vanderbilt children played with toys shipped from Paris, there was the master suite. Cornelius and Alice maintained separate bedrooms, as was common among the aristocracy of the period, but both rooms opened onto shared sitting areas with views of the Atlantic. The furniture was designed specifically for these spaces. The carpets were woven to match the wall coverings. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was merely comfortable. Everything was curated, controlled, arranged to communicate a very specific message about who lived here and what their lives meant. The message was simple. We are different from you. Our lives exist on a scale you cannot comprehend, and yet we are not barbarians. We are cultured. We are refined. We have taste. Taste, of course, requires labor. Every gilded frame needed polishing. Every silk drape needed cleaning. Every marble floor needed scrubbing. And the house itself, for all its appearance of timeless solidity, was a machine that required constant tending. The infrastructure of the breakers was revolutionary for its time. The house was among the first major American residences to be designed with fully integrated electrical systems from the beginning. Thomas Edison's electrical company provided the dynamos and wiring, and the boiler house was built nearly 100 yards from the main structure, specifically to reduce fire risk and isolate the noise and smoke of power generation. A tunnel connected the boiler house to the main building, allowing coal to be delivered and steam to be piped without disturbing the carefully manicured grounds. The heating system relied on steam radiators concealed within the decorative scheme, many hidden behind gilded grillwork designed to look like part of the ornamentation. Hot water flowed through pipes embedded in the walls, maintaining comfortable temperatures even as Atlantic storms battered the exterior. The plumbing included both fresh water and seawater systems, the latter used to fill the large marble bathtubs that the Vanderbilts preferred. The kitchen was located in the basement, connected to the dining room by a system of dumbwaiters and service stairs designed to move food quickly while keeping the noise and smells of cooking entirely separate from the family's experience. A French chef commanded a staff of 12 kitchen workers, and the pantries stored china services numbering in the hundreds of place settings, each piece hand-painted with the Vanderbilt monogram. But behind all these systems, behind the technology and the organization and the design, there were human beings. The house required a permanent staff of approximately 30 servants during the off-season and as many as 60 during the summer social season. These workers included footmen and maids, cooks and laundresses, gardeners and groundskeepers, stable hands and coachmen, and a butler who managed the entire operation with a precision that a military commander might envy. They did not live in the beautiful rooms. They lived above them, in the attic, where small bedrooms with sloped ceilings and minimal furnishings housed men on one side and women on the other. They descended service stairs that ran parallel to the grand staircase, invisible passageways that allowed them to appear and disappear without crossing the family sight lines. They woke before dawn and worked until after the family retired. They were paid wages that, while better than factory work, were hardly generous, and they were expected to be invisible. This invisibility was architectural as well as social. Hunt designed the breakers with an elaborate system of service corridors, hidden doorways, and back stairs that allowed the machinery of domestic service to operate continuously without ever entering the family's consciousness. A footman could polish silver in the pantry, carry it through a concealed corridor, and present it in the dining room as if it had materialized from air. A maid could enter a bedroom, clean it thoroughly, and exit without the occupant ever knowing she had been there. The goal was to make wealth appear effortless, to make comfort seem like the natural state of existence rather than the product of dozens of people's daily labor. The construction of the breakers required an even larger workforce. At the peak of building activity, more than 2,200 men worked on the site simultaneously. Many were Italian immigrants, recruited specifically for their skills in masonry, plastering, and decorative arts that had been passed down through generations of Italian craftsmen. They worked 6 days a week, often 10 or 12 hours per day, shaping limestone and marble, installing intricate mosaics, painting ceiling murals that required scaffolding 30 feet in the air. The materials arrived from around the world. Limestone from Caen, France, was quarried, cut into blocks, loaded onto ships, transported across the Atlantic, unloaded in New York, transferred to rail cars and hauled to Newport, where it was then transported by wagon to the construction site. Marble came from quarries in Italy, Africa, and Vermont. Bronze fittings were cast in foundries in France. Wood paneling was carved in European workshops and shipped in massive crates marked fragile in 5 languages. The logistics of coordinating these shipments, ensuring that materials arrived in the correct sequence, that skilled craftsmen were available when their materials were ready, that work proceeded efficiently despite weather delays and shipping accidents and the 1,000 small catastrophes of any large construction project, required a level of organizational sophistication that rivaled the railroads Cornelius Vanderbilt himself operated. And the speed was remarkable. Cornelius II wanted the house completed quickly. He was a man who believed in efficiency, who ran his railroad empire on strict schedules, and he applied the same expectations to his summer home. Hunt and the general contractor Carl Bitter worked at a pace that exhausted everyone involved. Craftsmen worked through the winter of 1893-1894, through rain and cold, through the kinds of conditions that would normally shut down construction entirely. They worked because Cornelius Vanderbilt was paying premium wages for speed, and because failing to meet his expectations was simply not an option. The house was essentially complete in the summer of 1895, just over 2 years after the old breakers had burned. Hunt had died that year, mere months before he could see the full realization of his final masterpiece. Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt hosted their first dinner party in July, and the social season of 1895 established the breakers as the undisputed centerpiece of Newport society. But what did it cost? The construction budget in 1895 dollars was approximately $7 million. Adjusted for inflation, that figure represents somewhere between $200 million and $300 million in today's money, though such conversions fail to capture the true economic magnitude. In 1895, $7 million represented the annual wages of over 10,000 average American workers. It represented more than the entire annual budget of many state governments. It represented, in the most literal sense, a fortune. And the construction was only the beginning. Operating the breakers required expenditures that would have seemed absurd to anyone outside the Vanderbilt orbit. The coal bill alone, for heating and power generation, ran to thousands of dollars each season. The staff wages represented a permanent ongoing expense, as did the food, the linens, the constant repairs and replacements that any house requires, multiplied by 70 rooms and the finest materials money could buy. A broken window at the breakers was not a trip to the hardware store. It was a commission to a specialty glazier, possibly in Europe, possibly requiring weeks of delay and shipping costs that exceeded the original installation. The grounds required a permanent staff of gardeners, landscapers, and groundskeepers. The stables required grooms and stable hands. The carriages required maintenance, and the horses required feeding and veterinary care. Every aspect of existence at the breakers generated expense, and the expense never stopped. But for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, during those first years, the expense was irrelevant. The family fortune generated income faster than even the breakers could consume it. The railroads threw off dividends in the millions annually. The investments compounded. The real estate holdings appreciated. Cornelius II could spend $7 million on a summer cottage and never notice the reduction in his net worth. This is the peculiar math of extreme wealth, a mathematics that most human beings never experience and struggle to comprehend. At a certain level of fortune, money becomes abstract. It stops being something you count and becomes something that simply exists, like air or gravity, a condition of the universe rather than a resource to be managed. Cornelius II spent freely on the breakers, not because he was reckless, but because, for a man of his wealth, spending on such a scale was actually quite reasonable. The tragedy of Cornelius II's life began just 4 years after the breakers opened. In 1896, his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt III, died of typhoid fever at age 21. The loss devastated Cornelius and Alice. Their remaining sons, Cornelius III and Reginald, seemed less suited to inherit the family mantle. Cornelius III had caused a scandal by marrying an actress against his parents' wishes, and Cornelius II had largely disinherited him. Reginald showed little interest in business, preferring horses, gambling, and the life of a gentleman amateur. In 1899, Cornelius II suffered a stroke while at the breakers. He was only 56 years old, but the combination of grief, stress, and the relentless pressure of running the family empire had broken his health. He spent his final months at the house, weakened and withdrawn, and died in September of that year. His wife Alice inherited the breakers, along with a complicated financial situation that was about to become significantly more complicated. Alice Vanderbilt continued to use the breakers as a summer residence for the next 3 decades. She maintained the house and grounds, entertained on a reduced but still substantial scale, and preserved the structure essentially as her husband had built it. But the world around her was changing in ways that made palaces like the Breakers increasingly anachronistic. The income tax, first instituted in 1913, began to bite into fortunes that had previously been essentially untouched by federal government. The inheritance taxes that followed meant that each generational transfer reduced the family's capital base. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression devastated even families as wealthy as the Vanderbilts, erasing paper fortunes and curtailing the dividend streams that had once seemed inexhaustible. By the time Alice Vanderbilt died in 1934, at the age of 89, the economics of maintaining the Breakers had shifted dramatically. Her daughter Gladys, Countess Szechenyi, inherited the property, but she lived primarily in Europe and had little use for a 70-room summer cottage in Rhode Island. The staff was reduced. Entire sections of the house were closed off. The gardens grew simpler. The carriages were replaced by automobiles, and then the automobiles grew fewer as well. The house that had been designed to announce unlimited wealth now announced something else entirely: the impossibility of sustaining such wealth across generations. This was not unique to the Breakers. All across Newport, along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive, the great cottages were encountering the same mathematics. The second and third generations of Gilded Age families found themselves unable or unwilling to maintain properties that had been built on the assumption of perpetually growing fortunes. Some houses were torn down entirely. Some were sold to developers who subdivided the grounds. Some simply deteriorated, their owners unable to afford repairs, but equally unable to imagine selling. The Preservation Society of Newport County was founded in 1945 with the explicit mission of saving these houses from destruction. The organization was, in many ways, a last-ditch effort by the descendants of the Gilded Age aristocracy to preserve their parents' and grandparents' legacies while acknowledging that private family ownership was no longer economically viable. In 1948, Countess Szechenyi leased the Breakers to the Preservation Society for $1 per year, allowing public tours to begin while she retained private use of the third floor. The arrangement was, by the standards of historic preservation, revolutionary. It allowed a family to maintain connection to their ancestral home while shifting the financial burden of maintenance to an organization better equipped to handle it. But the financial burden was enormous. Opening the Breakers to the public required insurance, security, staffing, and constant maintenance at a level that exceeded anything a private family would have needed. Tourists wear down floors. Their breath and body heat affect humidity levels. Their presence requires crowd management, bathroom facilities, gift shops, parking. The Preservation Society found itself not merely preserving a house, but operating what amounted to a small entertainment business. The first decades of public operation were a constant struggle for funding. Admission fees covered only a fraction of expenses. The Preservation Society relied on membership dues, donations, grants, and occasional windfalls from generous benefactors. Major repairs had to be deferred. Staff levels had to be minimized. The balance between preservation and financial sustainability was never comfortable. And the house itself fought back. Structures built to last a generation required different care than structures intended to survive for centuries. The limestone facade, exposed to salt air and New England winters, began to erode. The gilding, never meant to withstand decades without renewal, dulled and flaked. The mechanical systems, revolutionary in 1895, became obsolete and then unreliable and then dangerous. The breakers needed not just maintenance, but systematic renewal at costs that would have staggered even Cornelius Vanderbilt II. A single major restoration project could easily cost millions of dollars. The Great Hall ceiling required stabilization of the original canvas and careful retouching of the painted surface. The exterior limestone needed pointing and repair that could only be performed by specialists in historic masonry. The heating and electrical systems required complete replacement, with the new equipment hidden within the original decorative scheme to maintain historical accuracy. Each project demanded not just money, but expertise, planning, and the patience to do the work correctly rather than quickly. The Preservation Society developed strategies. Fundraising campaigns targeted wealthy donors who felt connection to the Gilded Age or to Rhode Island, or simply to the ideal of preserving beauty. Grant applications went to foundations interested in historic preservation, in American history, in architectural conservation. Corporate sponsorships provided funding in exchange for recognition and access. And always, there was the admission income, the steady stream of visitors paying to walk through rooms that had once been private. In 1972, Countess Sechenyi died, and her children agreed to sell the breakers to the Preservation Society outright. The purchase price was not publicly disclosed, but it represented the final severing of the Vanderbilt family's ownership of their greatest summer home. The breakers now belonged, in a legal sense, to the public, or at least to a non-profit organization dedicated to maintaining it for the public's benefit. The transition from private residence to public museum is never simple, and at the breakers, it raised profound questions about authenticity and purpose. Should the house be preserved exactly as it was in 1895, as if frozen in amber? Should it be allowed to evolve with later furnishings and decorations that reflected the family's continued use through the 20th century? Should it become a museum of the Gilded Age with educational exhibits explaining the social and economic context of its creation? Or should it remain simply a beautiful object, a work of art to be experienced without interpretation? The Preservation Society chose a middle path. The breakers would be preserved as closely as possible to its 1895 appearance, with later additions removed and period furnishings restored or recreated. But the experience would include audio tours, guidebooks, and docent presentations that provided context about both the beauty and the labor that created it. Visitors would learn not just who the Vanderbilts were, but how they lived and what it meant to be a servant in their household. This educational mission complicated the visitor experience. A tourist who simply wanted to gawk at the pretty rooms might feel lectured at. A scholar who wanted detailed historical analysis might feel the treatment was superficial. A descendant of the working class might feel uncomfortable celebrating the excesses of the aristocracy. A descendant of the aristocracy might feel their family's legacy was being unfairly judged. The breakers, like all museums, had to navigate between entertainment and education, between celebration and critique. The Modern Preservation Society operates 7 historic properties in Newport, of which the breakers is by far the largest and most visited. The organization employs over 200 staff members during peak season, including tour guides, security personnel, groundskeepers, conservators, administrators, and educators. The annual operating budget exceeds $20 million, with the breakers accounting for a disproportionate share of both expenses and income. And still, the finances are never comfortable. The admission fees, which now run to over $30 for a basic adult ticket and higher for special packages, cover only a portion of costs. The Preservation Society must constantly fundraise, constantly seek grants, constantly balance the need for income against the need to preserve the properties without commercializing them beyond recognition. The Christmas season has become particularly important. Each year, the Breakers is decorated with tens of thousands of lights and flowers, with holiday themes designed to evoke the splendor of a Gilded Age celebration. The event draws enormous crowds and generates substantial income, but it also creates challenges. The decorations must be historically appropriate. The crowds must be managed to prevent damage. The staff must work extended hours through what is supposed to be a holiday period. The economics of preservation require making the historic house work harder than it was ever designed to work. And the physical preservation continues, endless and expensive. In recent years, the Preservation Society has undertaken major projects to stabilize the foundation, which had begun to shift due to changes in the water table. They have restored the original coal-fired boiler house, converting it to a museum of servant life and household technology. They have repaired the seawall that protects the property from ocean erosion, a project that cost millions of dollars and will need to be repeated in future decades as sea levels rise and storms intensify. Climate change represents perhaps the greatest long-term threat to the Breakers. The property sits on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, exposed to the full force of coastal weather. Hurricanes have struck Newport repeatedly throughout its history, and each storm tests the structure's resilience. The famous hurricane of 1938 damaged properties throughout Newport, and future storms of similar or greater intensity are essentially certain. Rising sea levels will increase the erosion pressure on the cliff face. Changing humidity patterns will affect the preservation of textiles and paintings. The house that Cornelius Vanderbilt built to last for his children may not survive his great-great-grandchildren's lifetimes without continuous intervention. The Preservation Society plans for these threats as best it can. They monitor weather patterns and have emergency protocols for protecting the most vulnerable artifacts. They maintain insurance policies that would allow rebuilding in case of catastrophic damage. They invest in climate control systems that can respond to changing conditions. But ultimately, they are fighting against forces larger than any organization can fully control. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the Breakers. It was built as a statement of human mastery over nature, a declaration that enough money could transform raw materials into eternal beauty. But nature does not accept such declarations. Stone erodes, wood rots, metal corrodes, paint fades. Given enough time, every human structure returns to dust. The question is not whether the Breakers will eventually cease to exist, but how long human effort can delay that inevitability. The people who perform this effort are themselves largely invisible. The modern staff of the Breakers, like the servants of 1895, work behind the scenes to create an experience of effortless beauty. The tour guides memorize facts and develop presentation skills that make the history come alive. The security personnel watch the crowds for signs of trouble while trying not to interfere with the visitor experience. The groundskeepers maintain the gardens at a standard that would have satisfied the original landscape architects. The conservators, with degrees in art history and chemistry, carefully clean and stabilize objects that are more than a century old. They are paid better than the original servants, certainly. They have legal protections that domestic workers in 1895 could not have imagined. They can go home at the end of their shifts to lives that are entirely their own, lives the family never sees or controls. But they are still, in a fundamental sense, in service to the vision of people who died long ago, maintaining a standard that was set by others and can never be changed. The mathematics of their employment is straightforward. The Preservation Society must balance wages against all other expenses. Higher wages mean fewer staff or deferred maintenance or higher admission prices. Lower wages mean difficulty attracting and retaining qualified workers, which leads to worse visitor experiences, which leads to lower attendance, which leads to financial pressure that forces lower wages. There's no comfortable equilibrium. There's only constant adjustment, constant trade-off, constant negotiation between competing goods. Walk through the breakers on a summer afternoon, when the crowds are thick and the light streams through windows that Cornelius Vanderbilt himself once looked through, and you are participating in this economics whether you know it or not. Your admission fee becomes part of a revenue stream that pays wages and buys materials and funds insurance policies. Your presence adds infinitesimally to the wear on the floors and the humidity load on the climate control system. Your photographs shared on social media become part of the marketing that draws future visitors. You are not merely observing history. You are participating in the ongoing project of preservation. The breakers ask something of everyone who experiences it. It asks that you notice the beauty, certainly, that you appreciate the craftsmanship and the ambition and the sheer scale of the achievement. But it also asks that you consider the cost in labor, in money, in human lives organized around the comfort and display of a single family. The cost that continues today as staff members work weekends and holidays to keep the doors open. The cost that will continue tomorrow as climate change and aging infrastructure demand ever more resources for preservation. This is not a criticism. Beauty has always been expensive. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by craftsmen who worked their entire lives on projects they would never see completed, funded by tithes extracted from peasants who could barely feed their families. The paintings of the Renaissance were commissioned by patrons who controlled their artists' lives as thoroughly as any employer. The gardens of Versailles were created by laborers who died of disease and exhaustion in the swamps they were draining. Every beautiful thing we inherit from the past was purchased with someone's sacrifice. The question is not whether beauty is worth the cost. The question is who decides and who pays, and whether those who pay have any say in the decision. At the breakers, the original decision was made by a single man, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, constrained only by the limits of his imagination and his fortune. He decided what beauty would look like, how large it would be, what materials it would use, and how many people would labor to create it. The workers who built the house and the servants who maintained it had no voice in these decisions. They worked because they needed wages, and the Vanderbilts were offering wages, and in the calculus of survival that was reason enough. Today, the decision-making is more diffuse. The Preservation Society's board sets policy, guided by professional staff and influenced by donors and visitors and the general public. Government agencies impose regulations about historic preservation and workplace safety and accessibility. Visitors vote with their feet and their dollars, supporting the properties that interest them and ignoring those that don't. The process is messier than aristocratic command, but it is also more accountable. And yet the fundamental dynamic remains. Some people have more power than others. Some voices are louder. The wealthy donors who fund major restoration projects get to see their names on plaques and attend special events. The visitors who can afford the highest tier tickets get enhanced experiences. The staff members who clean the bathrooms and take the tickets have the least power of all, even as their labor is essential to the entire enterprise. The Breakers does not resolve these tensions, it embodies them. It stands as a monument to inequality and to beauty, and to the impossibility of separating the two. Every gilded ceiling reminds us that someone applied the gold leaf. Every polished floor reminds us that someone scrubbed it. Every visitor who admires the view from the terrace stands where servants once worked, invisible and essential. This is not a comfortable lesson. Most of us prefer to believe that beauty is innocent, that we can appreciate a sunset or a symphony or a great house without implicating ourselves in systems of power and labor. But the Breakers refuses this comfort. It is too large, too explicit, too obviously the product of concentrated wealth to allow any innocent appreciation. It demands that we reckon with what we are looking at. Perhaps this is the most valuable thing the Breakers offers. Not the beauty, though the beauty is real and moving. Not the history, though the history is fascinating and important. But the confrontation with our own relationship to wealth, to labor, to the systems that create the beautiful things we enjoy. A confrontation that most of us avoid in our daily lives but cannot avoid when standing in a room with a 50-foot ceiling and walls of imported limestone. The sun sets over the Atlantic, and the light turns golden, and the windows of the Breakers catch fire with reflected color. This is the moment the house was designed for, the moment when natural beauty and human craftsmanship combine into something that transcends both. The tourists are gone now. The gates are closed. The security guards make their rounds, checking doors and windows, ensuring that another day is passed without incident. In the basement, the climate control systems continue their endless work. In the attic, which once housed 30 servants, the spaces have been converted to storage and offices. In the boiler house, the old coal-fired equipment stands silent, preserved as a museum exhibit, while modern electric systems provide the actual power. The house is resting, but it is not at rest. It never truly rests. Maintenance is ongoing. Preservation is ongoing. The work that began in 1893 continues today, and will continue tomorrow, and will continue as long as anyone cares enough to sustain it. The Breakers exists because Cornelius Vanderbilt II had a vision and the money to realize it. But it survives because thousands of people across 130 years have continued to invest their labor and their resources in keeping it standing. The original workers are long dead. Their children are dead. Their grandchildren are dead or elderly. But the work continues, handed down from generation to generation, like the house itself, a chain of effort stretching backward to the Italian quarries and forward to conservators not yet born. This is what it means to preserve beauty. Not a single act of creation, but an endless series of acts of maintenance. Not a moment frozen in time, but a continuous process of adaptation and renewal. Not a monument to the past, but a living relationship between present and past, sustained only by ongoing commitment. The Vanderbilts did not pay for the Breakers. They paid for the initial construction. But the house has been paid for many times since, in admission fees and donations and tax exemptions and volunteer hours and government grants and the wages of workers who could have done something else with their lives but chose to dedicate themselves to this particular project of preservation. Who truly paid for this dream? Everyone who's ever contributed to its survival. And what does it cost to keep it alive today? More than any single person can measure, more than any budget can fully capture. The cost is distributed across thousands of people and decades of time, invisible in its totality even as each individual contribution remains small and manageable. This is perhaps the most hopeful lesson the Breakers offers. Great beauty does not require a Vanderbilt fortune to survive. It requires only that enough people care enough to contribute what they can. A ticket purchase here, a donation there, A lifetime of skilled labor from a conservator, a summer job from a college student, an hour of volunteering from a retiree. Each contribution is small. Together, they are sufficient. But sufficient is not the same as guaranteed. The Breakers survives today because the circumstances have been favorable, because American prosperity has generated enough surplus wealth to fund historic preservation, because Newport has remained a tourist destination rather than declining into obscurity, because no catastrophic storm or fire or earthquake has destroyed what cannot be rebuilt. Any of these conditions could change. The future is not written. The house will need a new roof eventually. The house will need another foundation repair. The house will need climate systems that can handle conditions the builders never imagined. The house will need defenders against budget cuts and political indifference and the simple human tendency to prioritize the new over the old. The house will need, always, someone willing to do the work. Tonight, the ocean continues its patient assault on the cliff face, wearing away millimeters of rock with each tide. Tonight, the humidity rises as the temperature drops, and the climate control systems adjust their outputs accordingly. Tonight, the gilt trim in the Great Hall continues its slow oxidation, atoms rearranging themselves in processes too small to see but inexorable over decades. Tonight, the Breakers ages, as everything ages, moving toward the entropy that claims all matter eventually. But tomorrow morning, the gates will open again. The tour guides will take their positions. The visitors will arrive with their cameras and their questions and their admission fees. The work of preservation will continue, small act by small act, person by person, year by year. The house will survive another day, and then another, and then another, for as long as human beings continue to believe that beauty is worth the trouble of maintaining. This is the answer to the question we began with. Who truly paid for this dream? Not the Vanderbilts alone, though they paid first and most. Everyone who has ever loved the house, worked in the house, visited the house, donated to the house, fought for the house. The dream is collective now, sustained by collective effort, owned by everyone who participates in its preservation. And what does it cost to keep it alive? Everything that such preservation always costs. Attention, money, time, labor, expertise, patience, love. The willingness to serve something larger than oneself, to dedicate effort to a project whose completion one will never see, to participate in a chain of maintenance that stretches backward and forward beyond any individual lifetime. The Breakers endures not because it was built to last, but because we continue to choose to keep it standing. That choice is made daily, in 1,000 small decisions, by people who will never know most of one another, united only by a shared commitment to preserving something beautiful for those who come after. The fog returns toward dawn, as it often does in Newport, wrapping the house in white silence. The ocean murmurs against the rocks. The security systems maintain their electronic vigilance. In the Great Hall, the painted ceiling depicts an Italian sky, blue and cloudless, a vision of eternal summer, of beauty beyond time. But outside, the real sky is gray and shifting, the real air is salt-tinged and cold, and the real house is aging, wearing down, requiring constant care. The painted sky will fade eventually, despite the conservators' best efforts. The real house will need repair and renewal, and eventually, perhaps, replacement. Nothing lasts forever. Nothing stays beautiful without effort. This is the truth the Breakers teaches, if we are willing to learn it. Beauty is not free. It is never free. It is purchased with labor and sustained with sacrifice, and it survives only as long as someone is willing to pay the ongoing cost. The Vanderbilts understood this in their way, spending freely to create something that announced their power and their taste. The Preservation Society understands it in a different way, counting every dollar and measuring every risk. And we, the visitors, are beginning to understand it too, as we walk through rooms built by anonymous workers and maintained by anonymous workers and destined to require the labor of workers not yet born. The price of beauty is service, not the service of servants to masters, though that was the Gilded Age way, but the service of the present to the future, of those who care to those who will come after, of human effort to the preservation of human achievement. This service is not glamorous. It does not appear in the photographs or the guidebooks, but without it, there would be no photographs to take and no guidebooks to write, because there would be no house left to photograph or describe. The Breakers survives. It will survive tomorrow and next year, and probably for decades to come. But its survival is not guaranteed. It is chosen daily by the accumulated choices of thousands of people who believe that this particular expression of human ambition and human craft is worth preserving. As long as enough people continue to make that choice, the house will stand. As long as the service continues, the beauty will endure. And so the work goes on. The conservators and the gardeners and the tour guides and the administrators and the donors and the visitors and everyone else who participates in this vast collective project of preservation. They are the true heirs of the Breakers now, not by blood or by deed, but by labor and by love. They are the ones who pay the ongoing cost, the cost that never ends, the cost that is simply the price of keeping anything beautiful alive in a world that tends toward decay. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, compromise, and service. This is the lesson the Breakers teaches. This is the truth its walls embody. And this is the gift it offers to everyone willing to look past the gilding and see the work beneath. The house stands, the fog lifts, the gates open. Another day of preservation begins. When you admire something beautiful that has survived across time, do you consider who is still paying, right now, today, to keep it alive for you to see?